Shirō Ishii between 1937 and 1945 in Pingfang District, Harbin, Manchuria. The Imperial Japanese Army operated a covert biological and chemical warfare research facility under the designation Unit 731. Commanded by Lieutenant General Shirō Ishii, the facility covered roughly 3 square kilometers and included laboratories, operating theaters, and prisoner holding facilities. The program operated under official military authorization and fell under the broader structure of the Kwantung Army. Prisoners held at the facility were predominantly Chinese nationals, along with Soviet, Korean, and Mongolian individuals. Internal records, later examined by Allied occupation authorities, indicate that between 3,000 and an estimated 10,000 people died within the facility between its establishment and Japan's surrender. Prisoners had no legal status under the facility's operational framework, were referred to internally by administrative designations, and had no access to outside communication or legal recourse. Researchers conducted experiments involving deliberate infection with plague, typhoid, cholera, and anthrax. Frostbite studies were performed by exposing prisoners to sub-zero temperatures, often outdoors, for extended periods. Vivisection was conducted without anesthesia, with internal organs removed while subjects remained alive, according to post-war testimony from participating personnel. Pressure chamber experiments, weapon fragmentation studies, and flame testing were also documented in facility records recovered after 1945. Japan's surrender in August 1945 ended the facility's operations. Personnel destroyed much of the physical evidence before Soviet forces arrived. United States occupation authorities subsequently granted immunity from prosecution to Ishii and key researchers in exchange for access to experimental data. None of Unit 731's leadership faced war crimes tribunals. The data obtained was incorporated into U.S. biological warfare research programs. Victim numbers remain disputed. Scholarly estimates range from 3,000 to over 12,000 deaths within the facility alone. Sigmund Rascher. From August 1942 through May 1943, at the Dachau concentration camp in Bavaria, Germany, SS physician Sigmund Rascher conducted hypothermia experiments under authorization from Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. The experiments were framed as research to assist Luftwaffe pilots who survived aircraft ditching in the North Sea. Dachau held tens of thousands of prisoners at various points during the war, and the experimental subjects were drawn entirely from the prisoner population. Prisoners selected for the experiments had no capacity to refuse participation. They were placed in tanks of ice water or exposed to winter outdoor temperatures, sometimes for periods exceeding 3 hours. Rascher's reports, preserved in post-war documentation, recorded core body temperatures, time to unconsciousness, and survival intervals. Between 80 and 300 prisoners died during these experiments, according to ranges cited in war crimes tribunal records. Precise figures remain contested due to incomplete documentation. Rascher attempted various rewarming methods on subjects who survived initial exposure, including warm water, immersion, radiant heat, and body contact rewarming, using female prisoners sourced from Ravensbrück. Internal Luftwaffe medical authorities raised methodological objections to the research quality, and some correspondence indicates friction between Rascher and mainstream military medical staff over his conclusions. The scientific value of the data was disputed even within Nazi institutional channels. At the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1946 and 1947, the Dachau hypothermia experiments were among the central charges. 7 defendants were sentenced to death and executed in June 1951. Rascher himself had been executed by the SS in April 1945 on unrelated fraud charges. The Nuremberg Code, a set of 10 ethical principles for human experimentation adopted in 1947, emerged directly from proceedings that examined these and related experiments. It became a foundational document in modern biomedical ethics. Thomas Parran Jr. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service initiated a long-term observational study in Macon County, Alabama, involving 399 Black American men diagnosed with syphilis and 201 uninfected control subjects. The study was designed to document the natural progression of untreated syphilis in the enrolled population. The Public Health Service partnered with Tuskegee Institute for Logistical Support and Participant Recruitment, and the program operated continuously under federal oversight until 1972. Enrolled men were not informed of their diagnosis in medically precise terms. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a colloquial phrase that covered multiple ailments in the local community. When penicillin became the established standard of care for syphilis in 1947, it was not offered to participants in the study. Researchers made active efforts to ensure enrolled subjects did not receive treatment elsewhere, including working with local draft boards during World War II to prevent subjects from accessing military medical evaluations that might have resulted in treatment. The study continued across multiple administrations of the Public Health Service and multiple presidential administrations. Internal reviews in 1969 concluded the study should continue. A panel examining the ethics of the program existed as late as 1969, without recommending termination. The study's continuation, despite available treatment, represented a deliberate institutional choice sustained over decades, not an oversight or failure to update protocols. A Public Health Service whistleblower, Peter Beekstone, provided documents to journalist Jean Heller, whose story ran in July 1972 and generated immediate public and congressional response. The study was terminated in November 1972. By that point, 28 men had died directly from syphilis, 100 had died from related complications, 40 wives had been infected, and 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. A class action settlement in 1974 provided compensation. President Clinton issued a formal apology in 1997. Pavel Sudoplatov. From the late 1920s through at least the early 1950s, Soviet state security organizations operated a covert toxicological research unit in Moscow, known internally as the Laboratory, later designated Laboratory Number 1 and subsequently referred to in declassified materials as the Camera, meaning chamber. The facility operated under successive iterations of Soviet intelligence structures, including the OGPU, NKVD, and MGB. Pavel Sudoplatov, a senior NKVD officer, oversaw operations connected to the laboratory during the wartime and post-war periods. Prisoners from the Gulag system and individuals under political sentence were transferred to the facility without notification to family members or legal representatives. They were subjected to systematic administration of compounds, including ricin, digitoxin, mustard gas derivatives, and various cyanide preparations under controlled conditions designed to assess lethality, time to death intervals, and detectability in post-mortem examination. Subjects were apparently told they were receiving medication as part of a different process. The operational purpose of the research was to develop reliable, undetectable methods of assassination for use by state security abroad and domestically. Testing on human subjects allowed researchers to calibrate dosing and confirm that compounds would not be identifiable through standard autopsy procedures available in Western countries. The program operated in near-total institutional secrecy, with access restricted to personnel with specific authorization. Soviet defector testimony and partial declassification of KGB archives in the 1990s provided the most complete available documentation of the program. Researcher Grigory Marinovsky, who led much of the laboratory work, was arrested in 1951 during the post-war political reshufflings, and his testimony contributed to later reconstructions of the program's scope. Exact victim numbers have not been established from available records. Estimates from researchers examining the archival material range from dozens to several hundred individuals killed during experimental procedures. John Charles Cutler. Between 1946 and 1948, U.S. Public Health Service researchers, led by physician John Charles Cutler, conducted deliberate infection experiments in Guatemala City, Guatemala. The research was designed to test the prophylactic and therapeutic effectiveness of penicillin against sexually transmitted infections. The program received funding from the National Institutes of Health and operated in coordination with the Guatemalan government and local institutional authorities. Subjects were drawn from institutionalized populations, including inmates at the National Penitentiary, patients at the National Mental Health Hospital, and soldiers at a local military garrison. Researchers deliberately exposed subjects to gonorrhea, syphilis, and chancroid through contact with infected sex workers, direct inoculation to mucous membranes, and, in some cases, inoculation of bacterial material into abrasions created on the skin. Subjects did not provide informed consent, and no documentation of consent procedures has been identified in the recovered records. Approximately 1,308 individuals were enrolled across the multiple exposure and treatment groups. At least 83 deaths occurred among the study population, though researchers examining the archived records have not been able to confirm how many deaths resulted directly from the experimental infections versus from other causes in an already institutionalized population. Follow-up treatment was administered to some, but not all infected subjects. The experiments remained classified for decades. Medical historian Susan Reverby discovered documentation of the program in 2010 while researching the Tuskegee Study. Her findings were communicated to U.S. government officials, and the Obama administration issued a formal apology to Guatemala in October 2010. Presidential Commission investigated the program and released a report in 2011 confirming the deliberate infection of subjects without consent. No researchers faced criminal charges in either the United States or Guatemala. Sidney Gottlieb. From 1953 through approximately 1973, the Central Intelligence Agency operated a covert research program designated MKUltra, aimed at developing techniques for behavioral manipulation, memory disruption, and involuntary extraction of information. The program was authorized at the highest levels of CIA leadership and administered primarily by the agency's Technical Services Division under chemist Sidney Gottlieb. It encompassed at least 150 sub-projects conducted through contracts with universities, hospitals, prisons, and private researchers across the United States and Canada. Among the most extensively documented components was the administration of lysergic acid diethylamide, commonly referred to as LSD, to subjects without their knowledge or consent. Experiments were conducted on mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and, in some cases, CIA employees and military personnel. The program's stated objective was to assess whether the compound could be used to destabilize a subject's mental state sufficiently to produce reliable information under interrogation or to implant false memories. In November 1953, Frank Olson, a U.S. Army biological warfare researcher who had been administered LSD without his knowledge during a MKUltra session, died after falling from a New York City hotel window. The CIA initially reported the death as a suicide. Declassified documents and subsequent forensic analysis in the 1990s raised the possibility that Olson's death was not a simple suicide, and a 1994 exhumation identified evidence of blunt force trauma. The case remains unresolved. CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of MKUltra records in 1973. A significant cache of documents survived because they had been misfiled in a financial records room, and these were discovered during a 1977 Freedom of Information Act review. Senate Church Committee hearings in 1975 and 1977 revealed the program's scope. The U.S. government later settled lawsuits brought by Canadian victims of one affiliated researcher. No criminal prosecutions of program architects resulted. Shirō Ishii. Between 1940 and 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731 under Lieutenant General Shirō Ishii conducted aerial plague dissemination operations against civilian and military targets in occupied and contested areas of China, including operations over the cities of Kuzhou, Ningbo, and Changde. Aircraft dropped containers filled with plague-infected fleas, grain mixed with cholera or typhoid-contaminated material, and, in some cases, contaminated cotton or foodstuffs over populated areas. These operations represented the operational deployment of biological agents developed and tested within the Unit 731 facility. The affected cities had populations ranging from tens of thousands to well over 100,000 inhabitants. Local medical infrastructure in occupied or besieged areas had extremely limited capacity to respond to epidemic outbreaks. In Ningbo in 1940, an outbreak of bubonic plague followed an aerial operation. Japanese military records later examined by researchers documented the operation, and Chinese medical records from the period confirmed an unusual plague outbreak. The civilian population had no advance warning and no access to treatment or protective measures. The Changde operation in 1941 involved the aerial dispersal of fleas and grain in and around the city. Chinese medical authorities documented a subsequent plague outbreak affecting hundreds of individuals. Post-operation Japanese records, examined by historian Sheldon Harris and others, indicate that researchers tracked the outbreak's spread to evaluate the effectiveness of the delivery method. Casualties from the confirmed operations are difficult to establish precisely. Individual outbreaks killed hundreds, with aggregate estimates across multiple operations ranging into the thousands. Unlike many aspects of Unit 731's activities, the field operations against Chinese cities left documentary traces both in Japanese military archives and in Chinese and international medical records from the period. After Japan's surrender, as with the laboratory experiments, the United States did not pursue prosecution of those responsible for the field operations in exchange for data. The operations constitute the largest documented state use of biological weapons against civilian populations in the 20th century. Philip Zimbardo. In August 1971, at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California, psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted a simulation study in which 24 male undergraduate volunteers were randomly assigned to roles as guards or prisoners in a mock prison constructed in the basement of the university's psychology building. The study was funded by the U.S. Office of Naval Research and designed to examine how institutional roles affected individual behavior. It was scheduled to run for 2 weeks. Participants assigned as prisoners were arrested at their homes by Palo Alto police cooperating with the study, booked at an actual police station, and transferred to the simulated facility. Zimbardo himself assumed the role of prison superintendent, a decision that later became a central point of ethical critique. Guards were given uniforms, reflective sunglasses, and nightsticks and told to maintain order. Prisoners were issued smocks, stocking caps, and identification numbers. Within 36 hours, one prisoner exhibited severe emotional disturbance and was released. Over the following days, guards increasingly adopted authoritarian behaviors, including sleep deprivation, forced exercise, humiliation, and denial of bathroom privileges. Multiple prisoners showed psychological distress, and Zimbardo extended the study's observation beyond what pre-existing protocols covered. An outside observer, Christine Masloch, who later married Zimbardo, raised objections to the conditions, which contributed to the study's termination after 6 days, rather than the planned 14. The study was terminated on August 20th, 1971. Its findings were widely cited in psychology literature for decades as evidence of situational determinism in behavior. However, later review of original recordings and detailed re-examination of the methodology revealed that guards had received coaching from Zimbardo's team and that subjects' accounts were more variable than published summaries indicated. The American Psychological Association subsequently used the experiment as a teaching case for research ethics violations. Zimbardo himself acknowledged methodological problems in later assessments. Aubrey Levin. Between approximately 1971 and 1989, the South African Defense Force conducted a covert program at facilities including Ward 22 of one military hospital in Voortrekkerhoogte, near Pretoria, in which gay and lesbian military conscripts were subjected to aversion therapy and, in some cases, forced gender reassignment surgery. The program was overseen in part by Army psychiatrist Colonel Aubrey Levin, who headed a military psychiatric unit. Homosexuality was classified as a mental disorder in South Africa's military and medical frameworks at the time. Conscription in South Africa was compulsory for white males, meaning that individuals identified as gay entered military service without alternatives to participation in its institutional structures. Personnel identified or reported as homosexual were referred to psychiatric evaluation. Those determined to require treatment were subjected to procedures including electric shock aversion conditioning, in which they were shown images and subjected to painful electric shocks as a behavioral conditioning mechanism. Refusal to participate in treatment carried consequences within the military disciplinary structure. Documentary research by journalist and activist Mickey von Zyl and later comprehensive investigation by the Aversion Project, a human rights inquiry, identified approximately 900 individuals who passed through the military aversion program. Forced surgical procedures, including orchiectomies and surgeries intended to alter genital appearance, were performed on an estimated several dozen individuals, though the precise number remains difficult to establish due to the destruction or inaccessibility of military records. South Africa's post-apartheid government did not prosecute individuals responsible for the program. Aubrey Levin emigrated to Canada, where he practiced psychiatry until arrested in 2010 on charges of sexual assault against patients in his Calgary practice. He was convicted in 2013. The full scope of the military aversion program was not documented in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's proceedings because former military medical personnel did not testify. Survivors have sought recognition and accountability without formal state response. Saul Krugman, from 1956 through 1970, at the Willowbrook State School on Staten Island, New York, researchers led by physician Saul Krugman conducted experiments in which newly admitted children with intellectual disabilities were deliberately infected with hepatitis virus. The school was a New York State institution that housed severely overcrowded populations of children with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Natural hepatitis transmission rates within the institution were extremely high due to overcrowding and inadequate sanitation. Parents of newly admitted children were in some cases told that participation in the research program was a condition of admission to Willowbrook, where the waiting list was long and alternatives were limited. This condition of access created a coercive enrollment environment. Children enrolled in the study were fed fecal extracts containing hepatitis virus, or were given injections of live hepatitis material. The researchers' stated justification was that the children would likely be exposed naturally and that controlled infection under observation produced milder illness with resulting immunity. Krugman's research team published findings that contributed to the eventual differentiation of hepatitis A from hepatitis B and to understanding of immune response to hepatitis infection. These scientific contributions are acknowledged in subsequent medical literature. The ethical dimensions of the research design, however, drew formal objection at the time from British medical ethicist Henry Beecher and others, who argued that institutionalized children could not provide meaningful consent regardless of any parent signature, and that the conditions of enrollment were coercive by definition. The Willowbrook experiments became one of the principal cases examined in the formation of U.S. federal regulations governing human subjects research. They were among the cases considered during the work of the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research, whose deliberations produced the Belmont Report in 1979. That documents principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice form the basis for the federal regulatory framework now governing institutional review boards in the United States. Josef Mengele. Between May 1943 and January 1945, at the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration and extermination camp complex in occupied Poland, SS physician Josef Mengele conducted medical experiments with particular focus on twins. Mengele had conducted research on twins as a civilian medical student and maintained a specific interest in heredity and genetics consistent with Nazi racial science frameworks. Upon his arrival at Auschwitz in May 1943, he assumed responsibility for selections at the arriving transport ramp and directed twins to be separated from other deportees for experimental use. Twins selected by Mengele were held in separate barracks at Birkenau and were not subjected to the immediate extermination process applied to the majority of arriving deportees classified as unfit for labor. The total number of twins held in Mengele's program has been estimated at between 1,500 and 3,000 individuals. Most were children, though adults were also selected. Experiments included comparative anatomical study, injection of pathogens to one twin with observation of illness progression in comparison to the uninfected sibling, eye coloring experiments involving injection of chemicals into the iris, and surgical procedures conducted without anesthesia. Mengele's documentation practices were inconsistent, and much of the data he accumulated was destroyed or evacuated as Soviet forces approached the camp in late 1944 and early 1945. Testimony from surviving twins, collected in the decades following liberation, constitutes the most detailed available record of many procedures. Of the twins who entered the program, approximately 180 survived to be liberated by Soviet forces on January 27, 1945, when the camp was evacuated by German forces. Mengele fled Auschwitz in January 1945 and eventually reached South America, living primarily in Brazil and Paraguay with assistance from former SS networks. He was never captured or prosecuted. Forensic identification of remains in Embu das Artes, Brazil confirmed his death by drowning in 1979. The experiments he conducted have no recognized scientific validity. Survivor testimony was extensively collected by organizations, including the Nazi War Crimes Records Interagency Working Group, and by individual researchers. Robert Stone. Between 1945 and 1947, and in follow-on programs through the 1970s, U.S. government-funded researchers conducted experiments in which patients at hospitals, including the University of California San Francisco Medical Center and the University of Cincinnati Medical Center, were injected with radioactive isotopes, including plutonium, polonium, and uranium. The earliest series was connected to the Manhattan Project's need to understand plutonium absorption in the human body. Robert Stone, a radiologist at the University of Chicago who worked on the Manhattan Project, was among the early coordinators of the research. Patients used as subjects were typically hospital patients admitted for conditions unrelated to radiation research. In several documented cases, patients were terminally ill with cancer, which researchers used as a justification for exposure on grounds that life expectancy was already limited. In other cases, patients whose long-term prognosis was better received radioactive injections without being informed that they were participants in government-funded experimental research. Consent documentation, when it existed, was vague and did not describe the experimental nature of the procedure. The scope of the radiation experiments was substantially broader than the initial Manhattan Project series. A 1994 review by the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, established by President Clinton, identified approximately 4,000 government-funded radiation experiments conducted between 1944 and 1974 across multiple institutions. These included whole-body radiation experiments conducted at the University of Cincinnati on cancer patients from 1960 to 1971, where patients received high doses of total body radiation, and at least 20 deaths were associated with the immediate effects of radiation exposure. The Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments released its final report in 1995, examining documented cases and the institutional frameworks that permitted them. The committee found that informed consent standards were routinely absent and that subjects were frequently drawn from populations with limited ability to refuse, including prisoners, the institutionalized, and the terminally ill. The committee recommended apologies and, in some cases, compensation. The experiments contributed to later regulatory requirements that consent for experimental procedures be specific, informed, and freely given.